I should have known something was wrong when the key worked on the first try. My grandfather's house had been empty for 3 years, ever since they found him in the garden, face down among the roses he'd tended with such peculiar devotion. The brass key slid into the lock with an ease that suggested recent use, though I knew no one had been inside since the funeral. The door swung open without the groan I'd expected from warped wood and settled hinges. The smell hit me first, not the mustiness of abandonment, but something else. Something that reminded me of my childhood visits, though I couldn't place exactly what it was. Clean, almost antiseptic, with an undertone of something organic, like a hospital room where flowers had been left too long. I stepped into the hallway, and my footsteps echoed in a way that seemed wrong for a house this size. The sound bounced back too quickly, as if the walls were closer than they appeared. The afternoon light streaming through the windows cast shadows that fell at angles that didn't match the furniture. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. That was the first thing that truly unsettled me. 3 years of vacancy, and not a single item had been disturbed. The same porcelain dogs sat on the mantelpiece, their painted eyes following my movement across the room. The same Persian rug lay centered on the hardwood floor, its deep burgundy pattern seeming to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. But it was too clean. The surfaces should have been layered with dust, the air thick with neglect. Instead, everything gleamed with the kind of care that suggested regular attention. I ran my finger along the mahogany sideboard expecting to find grime, but it came away spotless. The silence was different too, not the hollow quiet of an empty house, but something more deliberate, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or perhaps waiting for me to leave. I moved through the rooms methodically, checking each space against my childhood memories. The kitchen, where grandfather had made his strange herbal teas that tasted of earth and metal. The living room, where he'd sit in his leather chair for hours, staring at the wall where nothing hung. The study, lined with books whose titles I'd never been able to read, their spines marked with symbols that resembled letters but conveyed no meaning. It was in the study that I found the first photograph. It sat on the desk in a silver frame I didn't recognize, a black and white image of a man who looked exactly like my grandfather, but the clothing was wrong, too old, from decades before grandfather's birth. The man stood in front of this same house, but the house looked newer, as if the photograph had been taken shortly after its construction. I picked up the frame, and the glass was warm to the touch. The man in the photograph had grandfather's eyes, the same deep-set features, the same thin smile that never quite reached his mouth. But he was wearing a suit from the 1920s, and his hand rested on the shoulder of a young boy who looked disturbingly familiar. The boy looked like me at age 7. I set the frame down quickly, and it made no sound when it touched the desk. The silence seemed to absorb the impact, swallowing it completely. I backed away from the desk, but the photograph remained visible in my peripheral vision, the figures within it seeming to track my movement. That's when I noticed the shadows. They were too dark, too deep, pooling in corners where no shadow should fall. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows at full strength, yet these patches of darkness remained untouched by the light. They had substance, weight, as if they were made of something thicker than mere absence of illumination. One shadow stretched across the floor between me and the door. I hadn't noticed it when I entered, but now it lay there like a dark river I would have to cross to leave the room. Its edges were perfectly defined, too sharp for a natural shadow, and it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I stepped toward it, and it moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the fluid motion of something alive. It contracted slightly, drawing back from my approach, then expanded again when I hesitated. The movement was subtle enough that I might have convinced myself I'd imagined it, except that my grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. The shadows in this house are older than the light that casts them. He'd said that during my last visit when I was 12. I'd laughed at the time, thinking it was just another of his cryptic observations. Now, watching the darkness shift and breathe on his study floor, the words carried a weight that made my chest tight. I stepped over the shadow quickly, not wanting to find out what would happen if I stood directly in it. The floorboard beneath my foot was cold, so cold that the chill penetrated through my shoe and into my bones. The sensation lingered even after I'd moved away, as if something had taken root in my foot and was slowly spreading upward. The second floor was worse. The staircase seemed longer than it should have been, each step taking me further from the ground floor than the distance should have allowed. The handrail was smooth beneath my palm, worn by generations of hands, but it felt wrong somehow. Too warm, with a texture that reminded me of skin. The hallway at the top stretched in both directions, lined with doors I remembered from childhood visits. Grandfather's bedroom at the end, the guest room where I'd slept during summer stays, the bathroom with its clawfoot tub and medicine cabinet full of bottles whose labels I'd never been able to read. But there was another door now, one I was certain hadn't been there before. It stood between Grandfather's room and the guest room, painted the same deep green as the others, but the wood grain ran in the opposite direction. The brass knob was tarnished black, and beneath it, the shadow on the floor was so dark it seemed to extend down through the floorboards into the rooms below. I tried to convince myself I was misremembering. Childhood memories were unreliable after all. Perhaps the door had always been there, and I'd simply forgotten about it. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd run up and down this hallway countless times as a child, and there had been 3 doors, not 4. The door had no keyhole, no lock that I could see, just the black brass knob and a silence that seemed to emanate from whatever lay beyond. I reached for the knob, then stopped. The metal looked cold, but I could feel heat radiating from it, as if something on the other side was burning. Instead, I went to the guest room. It was exactly as I remembered it, down to the faded quilt on the bed and the water stain on the ceiling that resembled a face in profile. The window looked out onto the back garden, where Grandfather's roses grew in precise rows. They were blooming now, in October, their red petals so deep they appeared black in the afternoon light. Something moved among the roses. I pressed my face to the window, trying to get a better view. The figure was tall, thin, wearing dark clothing that seemed to blend with the shadows between the rose bushes. It moved with a strange, gliding motion, never quite stepping into the patches of sunlight that fell across the garden. As I watched, the figure stopped directly below my window and looked up. It was my grandfather. Not as he'd been when he died, aged and frail, but as he'd looked in his middle years. His face was exactly as I remembered it, but his eyes were different. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. And when he smiled, I could see that his teeth were the same deep red as the roses surrounding him. He raised his hand and waved, a casual gesture that might have been friendly if not for those terrible eyes. Then he turned and walked deeper into the garden, his form becoming less distinct with each step, until he merged completely with the shadows beneath the rose bushes. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The logical part of my mind offered explanations, grief hallucinations, stress, the power of suggestion in a place heavy with memory. But logic felt thin in this house, inadequate to explain what I'd seen. The floorboards creaked behind me, and I turned to find that the mysterious door in the hallway stood open. I was certain I'd left it closed. The opening was dark, so dark that I couldn't see the walls or floor of the room beyond. It was the kind of darkness that light couldn't penetrate, the kind that seemed to have substance and weight. A faint sound drifted from within, something that might have been breathing, or might have been the whisper of fabric against fabric. I should have left then, should have walked down the stairs, out the front door, and never looked back. Instead, I found myself moving toward the opening, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The darkness seemed to pulse with each step I took, expanding and contracting like a living thing. At the threshold, I stopped. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of something I couldn't see, but could feel pressing against my skin like cold water. The breathing sound grew more distinct, not one set of lungs, but many, all drawing breath in perfect unison. I fumbled for the light switch beside the door frame, though I knew somehow that it wouldn't work. My fingers found the plastic toggle and flicked it up. Nothing. But in that moment of reaching, my hand brushed against something else mounted on the wall just inside the doorway. Another photograph in a silver frame. I pulled it into the hallway light, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was the same black and white style as the one downstairs, but this image showed 3 figures standing in front of the house. The man from the first photograph, the boy who looked like me, and between them, a third figure I recognized with horrible certainty. It was me as I am now, wearing the same clothes I had on at that very moment. The photograph was dated 1924. My hands shook as I stared at the impossible image. The 3 figures stood in the exact same positions I'd seen in family photographs from my childhood, grandfather, me, and some other relative whose name I'd never learned. But this was different. This was wrong in ways that made my vision blur at the edges. The breathing from the dark room had stopped. I looked up from the photograph to find that the darkness had changed. It was no longer the impenetrable black of moments before, but a deep gray that allowed me to make out shapes within. The room was larger than it should have been, extending back further than the house's exterior walls would allow, and it was full of frames. Hundreds of silver frames lined the walls, each containing a photograph. They stretched from floor to ceiling, covering every available surface. Some were small, others large enough to hold group portraits. All were the same black and white, all bore dates from decades past, and all contained the same 3 figures in various arrangements and ages. I stepped inside, compelled by a fascination that overrode my terror. The floorboards beneath my feet were different here, older, worn smooth by countless footsteps. The air tasted of metal and roses, that same strange combination I'd noticed throughout the house, but concentrated now to an almost overwhelming degree. The photographs nearest the door showed the 3 figures as children. As I moved deeper into the room, they aged progressively, the images documenting decades of life I'd never lived, in times I'd never existed. But the faces remained constant. The man who looked like grandfather, the boy who looked like me, and myself as I appeared in mirrors. In one frame, we stood beside a Model T Ford. In another, we wore uniforms from a war I couldn't identify. There were birthday parties, holidays, everyday moments that felt familiar despite being impossible. The 3 of us aging and changing, but always together, always in front of this same house. At the far end of the room, the photographs became more recent. Color images now, showing the same figures in clothing from the 1960s, 70s, 80s. The man who looked like grandfather gradually became grandfather as I remembered him. The boy who looked like me grew into a young man I didn't recognize, but whose face felt like looking into a distorted mirror. And I remained unchanged, exactly as I was now, in photograph after photograph spanning decades. The final frame sat alone on a small table at the room's end. It was empty, its silver surface reflecting nothing but darkness. Beside it lay a camera, an old Polaroid model that looked well used. A single photograph had been ejected from the front, still developing, the chemicals slowly revealing an image. I picked it up with trembling fingers and watched as 3 familiar figures materialized in the developing emulsion. The same 3 figures, standing in this very room, surrounded by all these impossible photographs. The man who looked like grandfather smiled his thin smile. The boy who looked like me stared directly at the camera with eyes too old for his face. And I stood between them, holding a developing photograph of myself, holding a developing photograph. The image repeating infinitely inward like mirrors facing mirrors. The photograph finished developing, and I understood. This house didn't just contain my grandfather's memories, it contained all of them. Every iteration, every generation, every version of the same story playing out across decades. The shadows weren't cast by furniture or walls, but by time itself, pooling in corners where past and present overlapped. I was not inheriting the house. I was inheriting my place in the pattern. Behind me, footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow, measured steps that I recognized from childhood visits. Grandfather's walk, but not quite right, too rhythmic, too purposeful. The steps stopped just outside the doorway. "You found the room." His voice was exactly as I remembered it, but it came from the wrong direction. Not from the hallway behind me, but from somewhere among the photographs. I wondered how long it would take. I turned, but the doorway was empty. The voice seemed to come from the images themselves, as if the photographed figures were speaking in unison. "Every generation finds it eventually," the voice continued. "The room shows us what we are, what we've always been, what will always be." I looked down at the photograph in my hands. The three figures were moving now, subtle shifts in position that my eyes could barely track. The boy who looked like me was aging, growing taller, his features sharpening into those of a young man. The man who looked like grandfather was growing older, his hair whitening, his back beginning to curve. And I remained exactly the same. "The shadows remember everything," grandfather's voice whispered from the walls. "Every moment, every choice, every face. They remember because they are memory itself, given form and substance. And now they remember you." The empty frame on the table began to fill with an image, not developing like a photograph, but materializing like fog condensing on glass. It showed the garden outside, the roses blooming in their impossible October abundance. Three figures moved among the flowers, the man who looked like grandfather, the boy who looked like me, and myself. But in this image, I was the one with the black eyes and the red smile. I dropped the developing photograph and backed toward the door, but the hallway beyond was no longer the same hallway I'd entered from. It stretched impossibly long in both directions, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Each door was slightly open, and from each opening came the soft sound of breathing. The photograph I dropped landed face up on the floor, and I could see that the figures within were looking directly at me now. The boy who looked like me raised his hand and pointed toward the empty frame on the table. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Your turn." I ran down the impossible hallway, past doors that whispered my name as I passed, down the stairs that seemed to multiply beneath my feet, each step taking me further from the ground floor instead of closer, through rooms that rearranged themselves as I moved, furniture sliding across floors like pieces on a game board. The front door was exactly where I'd left it, but when I reached for the handle, my hand passed through it like smoke. I tried again and again, but I couldn't grasp anything solid. The door was there, I could see it clearly, but it existed in a space I could no longer touch. Behind me, footsteps echoed through the house. Not just grandfather's measured walk, but others, lighter steps that might have belonged to a child, and my own footsteps, somehow walking independently of my body. The sounds grew closer, converging from different directions. I pressed my back against the door that wouldn't open and watched as three figures emerged from the shadows of the hallway. They moved with that same gliding motion I'd seen in the garden, their feet never quite touching the floor. As they approached, I could see that their faces were exactly as they'd appeared in the photographs, but their eyes held depths that photographs couldn't capture. The man who looked like grandfather spoke first. "The inheritance isn't the house," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. It's the pattern, the endless repetition, the same story told over and over with only the details changing. The boy who looked like me stepped forward. "We've been waiting for you," he said, and his voice was my voice from childhood, but hollow, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "The pattern needs 3. It's always needed 3. I tried to speak, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but no sound came from my throat. The air in the house had grown thick, pressing against my lungs like water. The third figure, myself, but wrong, with those terrible black eyes, smiled with teeth the color of roses. "The shadows remember everything," it said in my voice, "and now they'll remember you exactly as you are forever." The room began to darken, not the gradual dimming of sunset, but the sudden darkness of a photograph developing in reverse. The last thing I saw was my own face, smiling back at me with an expression I'd never worn, as the shadows rose from the corners like a tide. When the darkness cleared, I was standing in the garden among the roses. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face, and the flowers bloomed with impossible beauty around me. I could hear footsteps on the path behind me, someone approaching the house, key in hand, ready to claim their inheritance. I turned toward the sound, and I was smiling. I could feel the expression on my face, though I hadn't chosen to make it. My teeth felt different against my tongue, and when I caught my reflection in the window, my eyes were the deep black of shadows pooled in corners. The footsteps grew closer. Soon, there would be 3 again. The pattern would continue, as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the house behind me, in a room that existed between moments, a new photograph was developing in an empty silver frame. I've been putting off writing this down for 3 months now. Every time I sit at my desk, my hand hovers over the keyboard, and I find myself staring at the wall instead. The wall in my current apartment, I should clarify. White paint, a small crack near the ceiling, completely normal. I've been checking that crack every morning since I moved in. Still the same length. The house on Maple Street looked ordinary enough from the outside. Colonial style, blue shutters, a front porch that sagged just slightly on the left side. I'd been house hunting for weeks, and my budget was limited. When I called the number on the for sale sign, the owner's voice was eager, almost relieved. We arranged to meet that afternoon. He handed me the keys at the front door and said he'd wait in his car. Something about having another appointment, but his hands were shaking when he passed me the key ring. 3 keys total. Front door, back door, and a smaller one that looked older than the others. When I asked what the 3rd key was for, he was already walking away. The front door opened into a living room that smelled of dust and something else. Something sweet, but not in a pleasant way, like flowers left in water too long. The hardwood floors creaked in all the expected places, and the afternoon sunlight came through the windows at normal angles. I made my way through the downstairs rooms, checking for obvious problems. Kitchen faucet dripped. Bathroom tile was cracked. Standard issues for a house this age. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. I'd seen the floor plan beforehand, so I knew what to expect. The master bedroom faced the street, the 2nd bedroom looked out over the backyard, and the 3rd was smaller, positioned at the end of the hallway, all exactly where they should be. But when I reached the end of the hallway, there was a 4th door. I stood there for a moment, counting. The floor plan clearly showed 3 bedrooms upstairs. I'd studied it carefully before coming, but the 4th door was unmistakably there, painted the same off-white as the others, with the same brass doorknob. I tried to orient myself to figure out where this room could possibly fit, but the geometry felt wrong. The hallway seemed longer than it should be, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The door was locked. I went back downstairs and found the owner still sitting in his car, staring at his phone. When I tapped on the window, he jumped. I held up the 3rd key and asked about the locked room upstairs. His face went very pale, and he told me that room was included in the sale, but he'd never been inside it. The previous owner had given him the same key with the same explanation. "How long have you owned the house?" I asked. "2 years," he said. "Never needed to go in there." I wanted to ask more questions, but he was already starting his car. He called out the window that I should take my time looking around, and if I wanted the place, I could call him tonight. The asking price was 40% below market value. After he drove away, I went back inside and climbed the stairs again. The fourth door was still there, still locked. I held the small key up to the knob, but something made me hesitate. The metal felt warm, though the hallway was cool. I told myself I was being ridiculous and slid the key into the lock. It turned easily. The room beyond was wrong. Not wrong in any way I could immediately articulate, but wrong nonetheless. It was roughly the same size as the other bedrooms, with a single window that should have looked out over the side yard. But the light coming through that window was different, softer, more golden than the harsh afternoon sun I'd left behind in the hallway. The floors were the same hardwood as the rest of the house, but the grain pattern seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. And the walls were painted a color I'd never seen before. Not blue, not green, but something that suggested both while being neither. A color that made my eyes water if I stared too long. There was no furniture, but the room wasn't empty. In the center of the floor was a circular mark, about 3 feet in diameter. Not a stain exactly, but a place where the wood seemed newer or older or simply different. When I knelt down to examine it, the mark appeared to be moving, rotating slowly clockwise. I blinked hard and looked again, but I couldn't tell if the movement was real or just my imagination. I stood up quickly, and that's when I noticed the sound. It was very faint, coming from somewhere. Not from the walls, not from the floor, not from anywhere I could identify. A low humming, almost musical, but not quite. Like a song heard from another room, but there was no other room, not in that direction. I'd already confirmed that this room was somehow occupying space that shouldn't exist. I backed toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, I realized I could no longer hear the sounds from the rest of the house. The settling creaks, the distant traffic, the normal acoustic backdrop of an ordinary afternoon. The fourth room was completely silent except for that humming. The silence was worse than the humming. I left the room and locked the door behind me. When I stepped back into the hallway, the normal sounds rushed back like water filling a vacuum. A car horn honked outside. The house settled with a familiar groan. I could hear my own breathing again, though I hadn't realized I'd stopped. I should have left then. I should have called the owner and politely declined. Instead, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress from house hunting, probably. The mind plays tricks when you're tired and anxious. But the price was so reasonable. I moved in 3 weeks later. The first few days were normal enough. I unpacked my belongings, arranged furniture, began the process of making the place feel like home. I avoided the fourth room entirely, though I was always conscious of its presence, like having a splinter you can't quite reach. On the fourth night, I woke to the sound of a door opening. I lay in bed listening. The house was old. Doors could swing open on their own if they weren't properly latched. But this sound was different, deliberate. The soft click of a handle being turned, the whisper of hinges that needed oil. I got up and checked all the doors on the ground floor. Front door, back door, closets, cabinets. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Upstairs, my bedroom door was open, but I'd left it that way. The bathroom door was closed. The 2 spare bedrooms were empty and undisturbed. The fourth door was still locked, but the key was no longer in my desk drawer where I'd left it. I found it on the floor in front of the door, as if it had been dropped there. The next morning, I told myself I must have sleepwalked. I'd been known to do strange things in my sleep during stressful periods. I put the key back in the desk drawer and made a mental note to see a doctor if it happened again. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time I would wake to the sound of a door opening, find the key on the floor, and return it to the drawer. I considered hiding the key somewhere else, but the idea made me inexplicably anxious, as if the key and the door needed to be in some kind of proximity to each other. After a week of this pattern, I decided to stay awake and see what was actually happening. I positioned myself in the hallway with a clear view of the fourth door and waited. The house settled around me with its usual collection of creaks and sighs, everything normal. At 2:47 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were coming from inside the locked room. Slow, measured steps as if someone were pacing, back and forth, the footsteps of someone who had been walking the same path for a very long time. I pressed my ear to the door, but the sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. I don't remember making the decision to use the key. I don't remember retrieving it from the desk drawer or returning to the door. But I must have, because suddenly I was standing in the fourth room again, and it was different. The circular mark in the center of the floor was larger now, maybe 4 feet across. And it wasn't just rotating, it was descending. Not physically sinking, but receding in a way that hurt to look at, as if the floor were stretching downward into depths that couldn't possibly exist. The humming was louder too, and now I could almost make out words. Not words in any language I recognized, but sounds that wanted to be language. Sounds that suggested meaning without quite achieving it. The window still showed that golden light, but when I looked outside, I couldn't see the side yard anymore. Instead, there was a landscape that belonged to no season I could name. Trees that might have been oak or maple, but their leaves were the same impossible color as the walls. And the sky was moving. Not clouds drifting across it, but the sky itself, rippling like water disturbed by something passing beneath. I turned away from the window and found that the room had grown longer. The far wall, which had been perhaps 12 feet away, now seemed much more distant. My footsteps echoed as I walked toward it, though the sound came from the wrong direction. Behind me, or above me, or from some place that had no name. The circular mark was definitely deeper now. I could see down into it, though there was nothing to see. Just darkness that went further than darkness should be able to go. And the humming was coming from down there, rising up through layers of space that folded in on themselves. I knelt beside the mark again, and this time I could feel air moving against my face. A breeze from below, carrying scents that made my stomach turn. Not decay exactly, but something organic that had been changed, transformed into something it was never meant to be. That's when I saw the hand. It was pressed against the underside of whatever surface existed at the bottom of the mark, pale, with fingers spread wide, as if someone were trapped beneath ice and trying to push through. But the hand was wrong. Too many joints in the fingers, too many fingers on the hand. I scrambled backward, but the room had changed again while I wasn't paying attention. The door I'd entered through was no longer behind me. Instead, there were 3 doors, all identical, all closed. I tried the handle of the first one, but it opened onto a wall of that impossible color. The second door opened onto the same room I was already in, creating a view that stretched infinitely inward like mirrors facing each other. The third door was locked. I could hear my own breathing now, sharp and quick, but underneath it was another sound. Someone else breathing, but not in rhythm with me. The breaths were longer, deeper, as if they belonged to lungs much larger than human lungs should be. The hand beneath the circular mark was moving now, the fingers flexing slowly, and there were other hands joining it, dozens of them, all pressed against that impossible surface, all wrong in their own particular ways. Some had too many fingers, some too few. Some were the right shape but the wrong size, and some weren't hands at all, but things that wanted to be hands. I backed against the wall, and the wall was warm. Not warm like heated plaster, but warm like skin. I jerked away and found myself standing at the edge of the circular mark. It was much larger now, taking up most of the floor space, and I could see that it wasn't really circular anymore. The edges were shifting, flowing, reaching toward the walls like slow liquid. The breathing sound was coming from down there too, along with the humming and something new. A scratching noise, as if fingernails were being drawn across wood, or as if something was trying to claw its way up from below. I ran for the window, thinking I could break it, climb out, escape that way. But when I reached it, I found that it wasn't glass at all. It was something softer, more yielding. When I pressed my hand against it, it gave way like thick membrane, and I could feel something pressing back from the other side. The golden light was fading now, replaced by a deeper glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And in that light, I could see that the room was full of things that hadn't been there before. Shapes that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Shadows that fell in the wrong directions. And in the corners, where the walls met the ceiling, there were spaces that went further back than the room should have allowed. I don't remember how I got out. I have a clear memory of standing in that room, watching the hands multiply beneath the expanding mark, listening to the breathing grow louder and more urgent. And then I have a memory of standing in my own bedroom, fully dressed, with the taste of copper in my mouth and dirt under my fingernails. The fourth door was locked. The key was in my hand. I left the house that morning and never went back. I called the owner from a hotel room and told him I'd changed my mind. He didn't ask for an explanation, and his relief was audible even over the phone. He said he'd already found another buyer anyway, someone who'd made an offer sight unseen. I wanted to warn them, but what would I say? That there's a room that shouldn't exist, that the geometry is wrong, that something is trying to push through from underneath. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe stress and isolation and too many nights of poor sleep created the whole experience. Maybe the fourth room is just a normal room with normal proportions and normal light, and my mind invented the rest. But I still have the key. I've moved 4 times since then, and the key comes with me. I've tried throwing it away, but it always reappears in my possession. In my pocket, on my nightstand, mixed in with my other keys as if it had always belonged there. And sometimes, late at night, I can hear it humming. The same tune I heard in that room. The same almost words that wanted to be language. Last week I found a real estate listing online. A colonial house on Maple Street, blue shutters, front porch that sags slightly on the left side. The price is 40% below market value, and the listing mentions that it's perfect for someone looking for extra space. It specifically notes that there are 4 bedrooms upstairs. 4 bedrooms. The listing has been active for 3 days, and according to the website, there have been no inquiries. But I know that's not true, because I can feel the key getting warmer in my pocket. And sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch myself humming along. The room is still there, it's waiting, and I think it's growing. I need to tell someone about the house on Maple Street before I lose track of what really happened. The details are already starting to blur at the edges, the way dreams do when you try to hold on to them too tightly. But some things remain crystal clear, burned into my memory like afterimages on a retina. It was 3 months ago when I first saw the listing. Not online, I've checked since then, searched every real estate website I could find. The paper advertisement was tucked between the classifieds and the obituaries in our local weekly, a small black box with minimal text. Victorian home, Maple Street, unique floor plan, inquiries welcome, a phone number, nothing else. I called because my wife Sarah had been talking about moving. The apartment was too small, she said, and we needed space for the baby that might come someday. The voice that answered was pleasant enough, male, middle-aged. He gave me the address and told me the key would be under the 3rd flower pot on the front porch. Take your time looking around, he said. The house likes to be explored. An odd thing to say about a house, but I've heard stranger things from property owners trying to make their listings sound appealing. The house itself was unremarkable from the outside. A standard Victorian, painted white with green shutters, sitting on a corner lot behind a low wrought iron fence. The front porch held exactly 5 flower pots, all containing dead geraniums. The key was where he'd promised tarnished brass that felt warm despite the October chill. The front door opened onto a foyer that seemed perfectly normal. Hardwood floors, crown molding, a chandelier that probably hadn't been updated since the 1960s. A staircase curved up to the second floor, and I could see doorways leading to what would typically be a living room, dining room, kitchen, all exactly as expected. I decided to explore the first floor systematically, starting with the room to my left. The doorway opened onto a hallway. This struck me as unusual but not impossible. Perhaps the living room was accessed through a corridor, or maybe this was some kind of mudroom situation. The hallway was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, with cream-colored walls and the same hardwood flooring as the foyer. I walked down it, expecting to find a room at the end. Instead, I found another hallway. This one was identical to the first, running perpendicular to it. 3 feet wide, cream walls, hardwood floor. I turned right and followed it, my footsteps echoing slightly in the enclosed space. After what felt like 20 or 30 feet, I reached another intersection. Another hallway, this one running left and right. I stopped and tried to orient myself. I'd entered the house through the front door, turned left into the first hallway, then right into the second then. I wasn't sure. Left again. The house hadn't looked large enough from the outside to contain this much corridor space. But old houses can be deceptive, with additions and renovations that create unexpected layouts. I chose the left passage and continued walking. The hallways were all identical, same width, same cream walls, same hardwood floors. The ceiling was standard height, maybe 8 feet, with simple white paint and no fixtures. There were no windows, no doors, no decorations of any kind, just endless cream-colored walls stretching ahead and behind me. After what felt like 10 minutes of walking, I decided to backtrack. I'd been turning left at each intersection, so I would turn right to retrace my steps. Simple enough. But when I turned around, the hallway behind me looked exactly like the hallway ahead of me. And when I reached what should have been the previous intersection, I found myself facing a straight corridor with no branches at all. I told myself not to panic. Old houses were confusing, especially when you were unfamiliar with the layout. I just needed to be more methodical. I would walk straight ahead until I found a landmark, then work from there. I walked for what must have been 20 minutes without finding anything different. No doors, no windows, no architectural features of any kind, just the endless cream walls and the sound of my own footsteps. The air had a stale quality, as if it had been circulating through the same space for years. When I finally reached another intersection, I stopped and tried to think logically. The house was on a corner lot, which meant it had neighbors on 2 sides. If I kept walking in one direction, I would eventually hit an exterior wall. From there, I could follow the perimeter until I found a door or window. I chose the left passage again and walked with more determination. My watch showed 2:47 p.m. I'd entered the house around 2:15, which meant I'd been wandering for over 30 minutes. Sarah would be expecting me home by 4:00. The hallway continued straight for what felt like 100 yards. My legs were starting to ache, and I realized I'd been walking at a faster pace than usual, driven by a growing sense of urgency. The cream walls seemed to press closer, though I knew that was impossible. At the next intersection, I found something different. The hallway to my right was slightly wider than the others, maybe 4 feet instead of 3. I turned into it immediately, grateful for any variation in the monotonous pattern. This corridor had a different quality to the light. I couldn't identify the source. There were still no visible fixtures, but the illumination seemed dimmer, more diffuse. The walls were the same cream color, but they appeared to have a subtle texture, as if they'd been painted with a slightly different brush technique. I walked faster now, almost jogging. The wider hallway had to lead somewhere different. It had to. But after another 10 minutes, it narrowed back to the standard 3-foot width, and I found myself at yet another intersection. 4 identical passages stretching away in cardinal directions. My watch showed 3:15. I sat down on the floor and tried to think. The house couldn't possibly be this large. Even if it had been built with an unusual layout, there were physical limitations. The lot was maybe a 1/4 acre, and I'd seen the exterior dimensions. What I was experiencing was impossible. But impossible didn't change the fact that I was still sitting in a cream-colored hallway with no visible exit. I stood up and tried a different approach. Instead of choosing directions randomly, I would follow the right wall consistently. This was a basic maze-solving technique. If you kept one hand on the wall and followed it, you would eventually find your way out. I placed my right hand on the cream-colored wall and began walking. The surface was smooth, painted drywall over what felt like standard construction. Nothing unusual about the texture or temperature. I kept my hand in contact with the wall as I walked, feeling for any irregularities. After 5 minutes, I reached a corner where the hallway turned left. I followed it, my hand sliding along the wall. Another corner, another left turn. Then straight for a long stretch, my palm growing warm from the friction of sliding along the painted surface. The technique should have worked. In any normal building, following one wall would eventually lead you back to your starting point or to an exit. But after 45 minutes of walking, I found myself at intersections that seemed entirely new, hallways that branched in directions I hadn't seen before. My watch showed 4:12 p.m. Sarah would be worried now. I'd told her I was just going to look at a house, that I'd be back in a couple of hours. She'd probably tried calling my cell phone, but I'd left it in the car. The car, I tried to remember where I'd parked it. In front of the house, on Maple Street. A blue Honda Civic that Sarah had been after me to wash for weeks. It seemed like a detail from another life. I was getting tired. The constant walking, the repetitive environment, the growing sense of disorientation. It was all taking a toll. I found myself stumbling occasionally, my depth perception confused by the uniform lighting and lack of reference points. At the next intersection, I chose the passage that seemed to slope slightly downward. Maybe I was on the second floor somehow, and this would lead me back to ground level. The decline was subtle, barely noticeable, but it gave me hope. The downward-sloping hallway continued for what felt like a 1/4 mile. My thighs burned from the constant walking, and I was beginning to feel genuinely concerned about my ability to find an exit. The house had seemed like a simple Victorian from the outside. How could it contain this vast network of corridors? The passage leveled out and brought me to the largest intersection I'd seen yet. 5 hallways branched off in different directions, including one that seemed to curve gradually to the left. I chose the curved passage, reasoning that it might lead around the perimeter of whatever space I was trapped in. The curved hallway was like walking through a very gentle spiral. The walls maintained their cream color and smooth texture, but the constant turning created a sense of motion that was almost hypnotic. I found myself focusing on the curve ahead, the way it seemed to promise something different just around the next bend. But the spiral continued for what felt like hours. My watch had stopped working at some point. The display showed 4:12 p.m., but I knew more time had passed. The battery must have died, or perhaps there was something about the house that interfered with electronics. I was definitely getting tired now, more than tired, exhausted. The constant walking, the stress of being lost, the growing realization that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. My legs felt heavy, and I was starting to stumble more frequently. The curved passage finally straightened out and brought me to what looked like a dead end. The hallway simply stopped, ending in a cream-colored wall identical to all the others. But when I approached it, I realized it wasn't quite solid. There was a gap at the bottom, maybe 6 inches high, just large enough to crawl through. I got down on my hands and knees and peered through the opening. On the other side was another hallway, this one slightly different. The walls were still cream-colored, but they seemed to have a subtle pattern, like wallpaper that had been painted over so many times that only the faintest impression of the original design remained. I crawled through the gap, my jacket catching on the rough edges of the opening. The hallway on the other side was the same width as the others, but it felt different somehow. The air was cooler, and there was a subtle smell that I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, but definitely present. This new section of hallways had the same basic layout, intersections every few dozen yards, identical passages branching in all directions. But the subtle wallpaper pattern made it feel like a different zone somehow. I was making progress, even if I didn't know progress toward what. I walked for what felt like another hour, following the patterned hallways through their endless intersections. The smell grew stronger, something like old paper or dried flowers, not threatening, but persistent enough to be noticeable. Then I found the first door. It was set into the right wall of the hallway, a simple wooden door painted the same cream color as the walls. If I hadn't been looking carefully, I might have missed it entirely. There was no handle, just a small circular depression where a doorknob should have been. I pressed my palm against the depression, and the door swung inward silently. The room beyond was small, maybe 8 feet square, with the same cream walls and hardwood floor, but it contained furniture, a single wooden chair facing away from the door, and a small table with something on it that I couldn't quite make out. I stepped into the room cautiously. The chair was old, probably Victorian era, with a high back and carved wooden arms. The table was equally antique, and on it sat a glass of water and what looked like a folded piece of paper. The water was clear and appeared fresh. I was incredibly thirsty after hours of walking, and the sight of it made me realize how dehydrated I'd become. But something about the setup felt wrong. Too convenient, too deliberately placed. I picked up the piece of paper instead. It was folded once, with my name written on the outside in careful handwriting. Inside, in the same precise script, was a single sentence: "The house likes to be explored." The same phrase the man on the phone had used. I looked around the small room again, but there was nothing else to see. Just the chair, the table, the glass of water, and the note with my name on it. I left the room and continued down the hallway. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The patterned hallways continued for what felt like miles. I found 2 more doors, but they were both locked, with no visible handles or keyholes. The first had been a gift, or perhaps a trap. The others were just reminders that there might be spaces beyond the corridors that I couldn't access. I was starting to feel genuinely desperate now. The exhaustion was becoming overwhelming, and I was beginning to have trouble thinking clearly. The hallways all looked the same. The intersections all offered the same meaningless choices. I could have been walking in circles for hours without realizing it. Then I smelled something different. Not the paper and dried flowers scent of the pattern section, but something that reminded me of the outside world. Fresh air, maybe, or the smell of rain. I followed the scent through a series of turns, moving faster than I had in hours. The smell grew stronger, definitely fresh air now, with hints of autumn leaves and cooling earth. I was close to an exit. I had to be. The hallway ended at another small room, this one with a window. I rushed to the window and looked out, expecting to see Maple Street, the front yard, my car. Instead, I saw another hallway. The window looked directly into a cream-colored corridor, identical to the ones I'd been walking through, complete with the same hardwood floor and uniform lighting. But that was impossible. Windows looked outside, not into other parts of the same building. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see more, but the view was limited, just another hallway stretching away into the distance. I tried to open the window, but it was sealed shut. The frame was painted over, and there was no hardware for opening it. It was just a view into more of the same endless corridors. The fresh air smell was gone now, replaced by the stale atmosphere I'd become accustomed to. I wondered if I'd imagined it, if my desperate need for escape had created a phantom sent to lead me forward. I left the window room and continued walking. The hallways seemed to go on forever, intersecting and branching in patterns that defied any logical floor plan. I was beyond tired now, moving forward on pure stubbornness and the animal need to keep searching for an exit. Then I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Not my own footsteps, but someone else's, coming from somewhere ahead of me. The same rhythm of shoes on hardwood that I'd been hearing from my own feet for hours, but definitely not mine. I stood perfectly still and listened. The footsteps continued, growing closer. Someone else was in the hallways with me, walking in my direction. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing. After a few minutes, I started walking again, moving more cautiously now. The presence of another person should have been comforting, but something about the way the footsteps had stopped when I called out made me uneasy. I reached the next intersection and paused, listening for any sound from the other passages. Nothing, but as soon as I chose a direction and started walking, I heard the footsteps again, matching my pace exactly. I stopped, the footsteps stopped. I started walking faster. The footsteps kept pace. I began to run, my exhausted legs protesting, but carrying me forward through the endless cream-colored corridors. The footsteps stayed with me, always the same distance behind, never getting closer but never falling back. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, then collapsed against one of the walls, gasping for breath. The footsteps continued for a few seconds after I stopped, then faded into silence. I was alone again, but the knowledge that someone or something else was in the hallways with me changed everything. I was no longer just lost, I was being followed. I forced myself to stand up and keep walking, but now I was constantly looking over my shoulder, listening for the sound of footsteps that might resume at any moment. The hallways seemed more menacing now, the cream walls more prison-like than merely confusing. At the next intersection, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were scuff marks on the floor, black streaks that looked like they'd been made by rubber soles. My shoes had rubber soles. I knelt down and examined the marks more closely. They were recent, and they followed the same path I'd been taking. But that was impossible. I'd been walking on these floors for hours without leaving any marks. Unless these weren't my marks, unless someone else had been walking the same route, wearing similar shoes, leaving traces of their passage. I stood up and looked around the intersection more carefully. All 4 passages showed the same scuff marks, dark streaks on the hardwood that suggested heavy foot traffic. But the hallways were supposed to be empty, just endless corridors in an impossible house. I chose the passage with the fewest scuff marks and started walking again. Behind me, I heard the footsteps resume, matching my pace exactly. The pursuit continued for what felt like hours. I would walk and the footsteps would follow. I would stop and they would stop. I would change direction and they would change direction. Always the same distance behind, never visible, never silent for long. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my mind. The exhaustion, the endless identical hallways, the constant sense of being followed, it was all combining into a psychological pressure that was becoming unbearable. Then I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the house. Up ahead, maybe 50 feet away, I saw myself. Not a mirror, not a reflection, but me, walking down the hallway in the same direction I was walking, wearing the same clothes, moving with the same tired gait. I could see the back of my own head, my own shoulders, my own familiar posture. I stopped walking. The other me continued forward, unaware of my presence. I called out, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the cream-colored walls. The other me didn't react, just kept walking at the same steady pace. I started running toward the figure, but it maintained its distance, always 50 feet ahead, never getting closer no matter how fast I moved. And behind me, I could hear the footsteps that had been following me, now running to keep up. I was chasing myself through impossible hallways while being chased by something that matched my every move. The logic of it was completely broken, but the experience was undeniably real. The chase continued until I was too exhausted to run anymore. I slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely, leaning against the wall and trying to catch my breath. The other me disappeared around a corner ahead, and the footsteps behind me faded to silence. I was alone again, but now I knew the truth. The house wasn't just a maze of hallways, it was something else entirely. Something that could show me myself, that could create the sound of pursuit, that could exist in ways that defied physical reality. I started walking again, no longer hoping to find an exit, but simply moving because staying still felt like giving up. The hallways continued their endless branching, their meaningless intersections, their cream-colored uniformity. Then I found the second note. It was lying on the floor in the middle of a corridor, folded the same way as the first one, with my name written on the outside. I picked it up with trembling hands and read the message inside. The house likes to be explored, but it doesn't like to be left. I looked around the empty hallway, but there was no sign of who might have left the note. The cream walls stared back at me, offering no answers. I kept walking, but now I was thinking about the note's message. The house doesn't like to be left. What did that mean? That I couldn't leave? That I was trapped here permanently? I thought about Sarah, probably frantic with worry by now. I thought about my job, my life, all the things that existed outside this impossible maze. They felt distant now, like memories from childhood, rather than the reality I'd been living just hours ago. The hallways continued, and I continued walking through them. I found more doors, but they were all locked. I found more windows, but they all looked into other hallways. I found more notes, each one signed with my name, each one containing a message that made less sense than the last. The house likes to be explored, but it doesn't like to be understood. The house likes to be explored, but it doesn't like to be mapped. The house likes to be explored, but it doesn't like to be escaped. I stopped reading them after a while. They were just another feature of the maze, like the cream walls and the hardwood floors, part of the system that kept me walking through endless corridors toward a destination that didn't exist. I don't know how long I've been walking now. My watch stopped working, and there are no clocks in the hallways. The lighting never changes, so I can't tell if it's day or night. I might have been here for days or weeks or months. But I keep walking because that's what the house wants. It likes to be explored, and I am exploring it, one identical corridor at a time. The footsteps still follow me sometimes, and I still see myself in the distance occasionally, but these things no longer surprise me. They're just part of the house, like the cream walls and the endless intersections. I found a pencil in one of the unlocked rooms, and I've been writing this account on the back of the notes I've collected. I'm not sure why I'm doing it, or who might read it, but it feels important to document what happened. The house on Maple Street is not what it appears to be from the outside. It's not a Victorian home with a unique floor plan. It's something else entirely, something that exists in the spaces between normal reality. And I think I'm becoming part of it now. The exhaustion is gone, replaced by a strange kind of acceptance. I no longer feel the need to escape, just the need to keep walking, to keep exploring the endless hallways that branch and intersect in patterns that make no logical sense. The house likes to be explored, and I am exploring it. I can hear footsteps behind me again, matching my pace exactly, but I don't look back anymore. I just keep walking through the cream-colored corridors, past the identical intersections, toward whatever lies around the next corner. The house of endless hallways has endless stories to tell, and I am learning to listen to them all.